Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Fadk Rahmanovich and I'm joined by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the Modern World. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into the ideas within the passage. Things like what implications can you draw and what conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. Now, in today's session, we'll be looking at Chapter 2, God, Man, and the Universe, Questions of Eschatology. So that's a nice and easy sort of title there. Let's begin with some stuff that caught your eye.
Alright, so let's turn to page 44. First full paragraph. We're going to be a few sentences down the sentence that starts without the eschatological realities. So, without the eschatological realities, the other teachings of religion would lose much of their compelling influence, and the spiritual tension of human life in this world, which is part and parcel of the reality of being human, would disappear, leaving human life without any ultimate meaning. This would happen since no matter what man achieves in this world, there is always the certitude that these achievements will ultimately flounder and disappear. The greatest material achievements, not only of the individual but also of whole civilizations, can and in fact do wither away. It is only the eschatological realities which bring into focus the permanent, abiding, and eternal consequences of human actions, precisely because human beings are beings created for immortality and the eternal world. Alright, so let's dissect this passage here. Now, the first thing that stands out to me is the word eschatological.
Yeah, that's a fun little word.
Right, so how about you briefly define eschatological for us, or eschatology?
So eschatology is, by OED, defined as a part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul of humankind. So to give you a sense of what exactly that is and what it deals with, we take a look at etymological dictionary. So it comes from Greek eschatos, last, furthest, utmost, extreme, most remote, blah blah blah. So the study of the thing that comes in at the very end, and it's usually considered to study four things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And every major religion, in fact every major civilization, has some sort of an eschatological understanding of reality.
Alright, so our sentence here begins with without the eschatological realities. So that implies right there that Islam has eschatological realities. Hopefully you've heard about them before. How about we go into just a little brief detail? What are the basic eschatological realities of Islam?
So again, if we take death, judgment, heaven, and hell, you have the idea that you have to perish as an individual, the idea that the universe is going to ultimately perish, and then there's going to be some sort of resurrection, judgment, and then heaven and hell are the consequences of that judgment at the very end. That's the sort of sales pitch.
Sure. And let's not forget that within the death category, that also includes the period of time when you're in the grave, which there are numerous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ explained in detail what happens to us in the grave.
Correct.
As well. There's also many hadith that explain in detail what happens on Judgment Day.
Plenty of ayat too.
Alright, so without the eschatological realities, the other teachings of religion would lose much of their compelling influence. Let's look at that second part now. The idea that the other teachings of religion would lose much of their compelling influence. So first off, compelling. That gets at the idea that we as Muslims feel a pull, a requirement, right, that we must do certain things, right? But why do we have this compelling influence on us?
Well, the idea is that whatever it is that you're asked to do by any system, by the way, it doesn't really matter whether you're looking at secular ethical systems or religious ones. You're going to find some sort of need for a rational explanation as to why certain things ought to be done or ought to be avoided. Right? So there has to be some version of consequence in place. The problem is, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr notes this in the later sentences there, if there is nothing after death, problem one is that all the benefits and the merits have to play out in this world, and that's rather obviously not really happening. But your death becomes equivalent to the end of the universe. So your death as an individual to you is the same as if the entirety of the universe collapsed all at once. Because as far as you're concerned, well, there is no you to be concerned anymore, right? So
Sure.
whether it's just you dying or the whole universe poofing out of existence, the end result to you is the same. And so anything that you've done in this life just doesn't carry over anymore. It doesn't do anything, right? That there is no long-term benefit to the fact that you have sacrificed so much in order to make the world a better place. The moment you die, it's meaningless.
Right. I'm sure you've heard people say before things like, why do bad things happen to good people? Or the opposite of that, right? Why do these horrible people live out these long, full lives and then get to die peacefully in their sleep at the age of 90? If there were any justice in the universe, that would never happen.
And yeah, that is a perfect sort of summation of why you need some sort of an eschatological portion of your understanding of the world, because otherwise you have, it's not like this is a new problem. For anybody interested, check out Plato's Republic, Book 2. This is the argument made by Glaucon. In what way is the most unjust man worse off than the most just man, given that the most unjust man gets all the benefits of material reality, while the most unjust man only gets the worst possible horrid treatment, followed by a most violent death. And so in order to square that circle, what you have to do ultimately is you need a way of extending past the limits which death imposes. This, by the way, just sort of in terms of a little bit of a historical background, this is what you start getting in Europe in the late 17th, early 18th century with the rise of existentialism. And so you're going to get people like Soren Kierkegaard, and then Dostoevsky, and then off of them you're going to get Nietzsche and Heidegger, and then Sartre. And it's the existentialist project which sort of comes to this same realization that a human being always stands in relation to the utter nothingness which is death. And so there is no meaning to be had even in life, because ultimately it's all for nothing. And Kierkegaard, being a sort of hyper-religious individual, it comes to the conclusion that the only way you get out of that nihilism which that vision presents you with is religiously. There is no other way forward. Nietzsche just sort of embraces it and says, live it up while you're here.
Sure. You have people going and searching for meaning as a consequence of this. I'm reminded, there's the song by the Beatles, "All You Need Is Love." Right? That seems to have become a pretty popular one lately, right? The idea that that's the meaning of life, just to love one another and to all get along, right? I don't want to go too far off on a tangent here, but the short story by Anton Chekhov, it's called "The Bet."
Yes.
Read it. It is a short story. It won't take you very long to read anyway. Towards the end of it, our protagonist...
Spoiler alert.
No, not the very end. But yes, towards the end of it, our protagonist, there's a section where the man who is observing him notices that it seems that he is searching for meaning. I believe he uses the metaphor like someone who's adrift at sea and is just trying to grab on to any piece of driftwood or anything else to keep him afloat. And I think the point that Chekhov is trying to make is precisely this, that the protagonist in the story can't find a purpose anymore, can't find a sense of meaning, and he's trying to search for it in any possible source. He looks at philosophy, he looks at medicine and science, and he's just not finding it anywhere. Okay, anyway, let's move back a little bit. So then, how does Islam resolve these types of questions?
Religiously. No, the idea is that...
But I'm referring specifically to questions like, why do bad things happen to good people?
Oh, well, it's because ultimately the idea of whatever happens in life, and I'm sure everybody's heard this metaphor used before, the idea is that this is a test. The only problem is that we only see the negative stuff as a test, and we see the positive stuff as just a bonus.
Sure.
Right?
When
Islamically,
in reality,
yeah.
When in reality, those positive things can actually be the more difficult tests to pass. Partly because people don't see it, but also because it's so much easier when things are going bad to turn back to Allah and to say, I'm gonna go and pray and please, help me. When things are going good, people tend to think, oh, it was because of me. It was because of my actions that things went well. There's the classic story of the two men with the gardens, right? The one man that has the nicer garden than the other one, and he's talking all about, this is all the result of my work, nothing will ever take this away from me, even if Allah did take it from me, it would give me something better, and it gets destroyed.
Oops. No, but actually that's sort of the idea that it's all us, the idea that in bad times we turn to whatever source of our meaning is, to figure out how to be, and then as soon as things go right, we turn back away. There's a really awesome Rick and Morty moment that they're falling through some black hole, and his little teleporter thing isn't working, and so he turns to God, and he's like, God, if you only make it work, I'll totally believe in you. And at that moment, the little thing starts working, and he goes like, oh, never mind, I got it. So it's one of those things. But the general idea is something like this: the purpose of life, Islamically speaking, is that you are supposed to earn, isn't quite the right word, but let's go with it. You're supposed to earn the outcome of the afterlife, not by the outcomes of what you do, but by the effort that you put in. Right? Are you properly oriented, and are you putting in the effort that you ought to be putting in? And in that case, this is essentially the most just and unjust man problem. It doesn't matter how good you have it here, if the end result of that is then eternity of not so good real estate, then none of that good real estate here sort of means anything, right? Because infinity minus anything finite, it just ends up being still infinity. So that's the sort of idea. Now, I know this can sound a bit hollow, but if you think about it this way, if you have a crazy happy life, right? You got money, you got friends, you have everything, and then when you're 80, your family gets brutally murdered, and you get some very painful disease that is incurable, and so on and so forth. Do you really sort of look at your life and go like, this was great? It's like, no, you don't, right? You are actually consumed by the pain and suffering. And to a certain extent, the same thing in reverse, right? I don't know if any of you have had occasion to spend prolonged time in a hospital where you are the patient. It's never a fun experience. There's like 80 different tubes coming out of you. But as sucky as that is, the day that you feel no pain, it's as if that pain was never there. right? Having gone through a whole lot of reconstructive surgeries, I can sort of attest to this. Literally, the moment that the pain stops, it is as if it has never been. So that's the sort of idea. So you can only accomplish that through the eschatological view of the world, right? Where death isn't the end, death is just part of stage two, and in fact, that stage two is a permanent stage, unlike the sort of living one, which is temporary. And ultimately, for those of you who haven't read the Republic, that is Plato's answer to Glaucon's question. You know, at the very end of the Republic, the argument that's being made is that the soul of the just person in afterlife continues to do the same thing that it did while it was alive, and that is pursue these concepts like justice and truth and so on. And the lack of a physical body is no barrier to that. But the soul of the most unjust man continues doing what it did in life, which is to seek after material pleasures. Well, there's a problem. Because you're no longer embodied, you can never ever attain those material pleasures again. So it is literally an eternity of frustration. So yeah, even Plato sort of came to the idea that you need some sort of an eschatological out in order to get around, you know, bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people.
Okay. So part of the Islamic response is that Allah chooses to give different kinds of tests to different people. There is also a place, again, I can't remember if it's in the Quran or if it's in a hadith, but there is somewhere that would roughly translate as, if Allah cared, if the world had even the slightest amount of value to Allah, He wouldn't allow the disbelievers to even have like one drink of water. They have nothing at all. So
I'm a little confused about that front part. I seem to remember something like that, but it starts off with something along the lines of if God immediately instantiated reward and punishment rather than delaying it until a certain point, i.e. the point of judgment, then just wipe out.
We may have to look that one up. Right. One of the things that we want to do here, though, is talk about the implications of these ideas and conclusions that you can draw from them. So, if Allah chooses to give different kinds of tests to different people, then that means everything up to how long you are going to live is ultimately the decree of Allah. And what that means is that you aren't actually entitled to anything. Right? That's kind of a harsh truth of life. There's some people approach it from a secular standpoint as well. You can also approach it from a religious standpoint, which is you deserve nothing. Right? You're not entitled to anything. You're not entitled to any particular amount of wealth or comfort. You're not entitled to even be capable of bearing children, right? Which seems unfair to a lot of people. You're not entitled to live a, quote, long, healthy life either. Your fate might be that you die at the age of 30 from a genetic disease. But if Allah is our creator, and we are ultimately abd, we are ultimately slaves of Allah, and we ultimately have no right to question the decree of Allah, then we are not entitled to anything.
So I think we actually need to break that down a little, because there's two ways you can understand it, and I think one of the ways is sort of what you mean, and the other way would be to very badly mischaracterize what your statement is there, and then, you know, internet trolls abound.
Go ahead and mischaracterize away.
Well, no, I don't want to mischaracterize. I think the idea is when we talk about the no entitlement, what you mean is something like you're not entitled to anything, to any state of affairs from God. But at the same time, you're described as a sort of thing that has nobility that has rights, as in God describes as the sort of thing that has rights, and what those rights are, and the idea that where there are rights, there have to be corresponding responsibilities, i.e., if you have a right to life, then everybody around you who also agrees that you have a right to life has a responsibility to attempt to preserve your life, and so on. So you are entitled to, let's say, the efforts of other people on the things that you have a claim to right to.
Sure.
Now that is from people. That is not
sure.
from God, and the outcome is not part of that determination. Mm-hmm. It's their job to make the effort, not to change the outcome. A doctor, so you might have that rare genetic disease, a doctor is responsible for treating his patient, right? He cannot make this, what's it called, fatalistic outlook, right? And so a patient comes into an ER bleeding, and the doctor goes like, well, God has decreed when they'll die, and then they just stand aside, right? Like that's not the job of the doctor. That's not his responsibility. His responsibility is to do whatever he can in order to fulfill the rights of the other person insofar as they're capable. But whether or not they'll manage to save their life or not, that's not up to them in any way, shape, or form. Ultimately, that's sort of, we call that the luck of the draw, but Islamically it wouldn't really be luck in any meaningful way.
No, you're right. I'm thinking of this in terms of man's relationship to God, or man's relationship with God here. Specifically in that context, you are entitled to nothing from God. In terms of the rights that you're discussing there, or the entitlements, one interesting thing to me about those is those are all things that ultimately come from God. Still, you have those rights, right? You have rights on other people have rights on you, your body has rights on you, etc. Why do we know that? We know it because God said so. Ultimately, Allah told us, and through the Prophet as well, that these are the rights that your family has on you, other people have on you, your neighbors, etc.
So to take it back to the previous chapter in our discussion of metaphysics, these would be the sorts of metaphysical axioms that Islam starts with. Right? Now, if you take those things as given, and as a Muslim you would, then you get all the rest of this to sort of precipitate out. So that's sort of the setup there. Obviously, if you are not starting from an Islamic standpoint, you're going to have a very different theory of the world, which is entirely understandable because you're starting off with an entirely different set of axiomatic assumptions about what the world is, what you are, and how you're supposed to relate to the world. So yeah, I'm bringing that up to make sure that occasionally people will hear a discussion like this and come to the conclusion that the fact that Islam says this means that everybody agrees, and like, no, Muslims agree. Or rather, Muslims who understand what's going on agree. If you start off, in fact, from that assumption that there is no eschatological realities to humanity, then you don't have to agree with any of this, right? Life ends at death. The life of you entirely ends at death. There's nothing beyond that. And obviously, if you start out from that assumption, you're going to come to some very wildly different conclusions.
Great. Let's move on. The next part says, and the spiritual tension of human life in this world, which is part and parcel of the reality of being human, would disappear, leaving human life without any ultimate meaning. We've already covered the leaving human life without any ultimate meaning part, but let's back up just a second there. We have a term here, spiritual tension. What do you think Sayyid Hussein Nasr is trying to say here?
So, as far as I take his meaning, there is this understanding that human beings are kind of awkward creatures, uniquely awkward, perhaps, and that awkwardness comes from the let's call it a dualism, which may not be quite accurate, but let's assume that it is for the moment, of your body and therefore your emotions, your desires, and then your soul or reason, which is, well, rational. And so there is the reality of your emotions and your desires pulling you one way, and then your reason and your soul trying to sort of pull you back the other. And Islam, unlike, let's say, religions that have a strong focus on monasticism, it actually prohibits the sort of monasticism in the sense of like separating yourself off from the world and just, going to live alone in the forest for the rest of your life kind of attitude. That's not something that is allowed, because you have all these responsibilities for the society and all the rest of that. So you're supposed to stay balanced, right? You're supposed to have your emotions, but you have to govern them by reason, and then you're supposed to sort of balance yourself in the middle, and that is the sort of tension that you experience, and you're supposed to always sort of maintain the balance there. You're not supposed to go too far either way. So you can't detach yourself from society and from the physical reality, but you also can't detach yourself from reason. And the other way of sort of thinking of this is that people might be more familiar with this, is that in a way humanity is lower than animals on a sort of moral scale, because we behave in such abhorrent ways, or rather we're pulled to behave in such abhorrent ways. On the other hand, we are actually more elevated than the angels, because we are capable of going above them in our way of being. And so you have that tension again, right, pulling you down and pulling you up. But the only reason why you would be willing to engage in maintaining that tension, right, the only reason why you would sacrifice just acting out your animalistic urges, is if there is some sort of a return on investment, right, an ROI. So it makes sense to not do all the things that you're prohibited from doing, even though those prohibited things would give you immediate material pleasure, right? And so you're going to sacrifice all of that so that you can get something else. A simple analogy: people who want to go into medicine, they know from high school that they want to go into medicine, and then they have to sacrifice their nights, their weekends, their time with friends, their free time just sort of relaxing. They're studying all the time. Their GPA has to be through the roof. They have to do 1,000,001 extracurricular activities. Like, everything has to be perfect. And they're doing all of this sacrificing of the material present for some imagined future, right? Nothing guarantees that they're going to get into med school. In fact, only like 38% of applicants get in. So 2/3 of people making the sacrifice are going to get nothing out. Well, it's not nothing out of it, but they won't, get the thing that they want out of it. And that sacrifice is considered worth it because what they get out of it, right, the value that they're supposed to recuperate down the line is supposed to be greater than whatever it is that they sacrifice to get into it, right? And again, that's a return on investment. You're sacrificing some chunk of your life now for a better future later. Religiously, you're sacrificing the entirety of your life now, in terms of you are never going to let your emotions run off with you, and you're always going to keep them in check in accordance with these rules, so that you can get the return on your investment in an eschatological sense.
One of the interpretations of the hadith, I believe it's a hadith, that this life is like a prison for the believer, and it's like a paradise for the disbeliever, is precisely that idea, right? That in this life you are doing all that sacrificing, but in the next life you'll get the benefit from it. Whereas for the disbeliever, they're getting all of the good, they're getting all the nice things now. They're getting to fulfill all of their material pleasures, but it's going to pass. Anyway, let's move on.
Oh, by the way, actually, I just want to spend a second on that last phrase that you used because I think it's actually really important. The idea that it's going to pass. By very definition of anything with a material nature, that has to be the case, right? Everything breaks down, entropy sets in, everything fails. You look at somebody like Arnold, right? That guy in his prime looked like those statues of Greek gods. But you see him now, and he's still in like way better shape than most people. But like he's deflating because obviously that's what happens to material anything. So if you attach yourself to material goods, it necessarily results in attaching yourself to things that fail and are wiped out. And so if you tie the meaning of your existence to material things, that meaning itself has to then wear out as those things wear out. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting turn of phrase.
And when people realize that, especially if they've reached old age, they look back and they wonder, right, what was this all for? That's where you get existential crises, like someone having a midlife crisis.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, that's ultimately all that a midlife crisis is. It's the realization that whatever it is that you sacrificed for, now that you've got it, it's not a worthy enough return on your investment, right? So what ended up happening, imagine that hypothetical doctor there, right? So somebody who they put essentially all the rest of their life on hold to make sure that they go to the best possible medical school and they manage to get in and all the rest of that. But what they sacrificed was whatever, their significant other, right? Like they couldn't commit to getting married because they were too busy with school and so on and so forth. And now they're 50 and sure that they may be, doing very well as a doctor. So in that sense, they're doing great. But if what they got doesn't provide meaning for them, right? Then they look at it and they go like, wait, why did I just sacrifice like the last 40 years of my life for this? I don't want this. I would trade it in a heartbeat for all the things that I gave up. And that's that sort of moment of like panic. And that's why those same people tend to sort of go out and they try to relive that time that they lost. So the things that they gave up, they're trying to get them back. But of course it doesn't work because no matter what you do, you can't be 20 again. Right? And so it's an ultimate sort of destruction of self to commit to things whose value you don't actually or you won't actually find as important as you assumed that you would, and that makes all the sacrifice between now and then entirely pointless.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you said there, you can't be 20 again. That works off of the assumption that the things that they want are those things associated with youth that they couldn't have, the things that are associated with like fun, right? Let's compare that to someone who has a midlife crisis in which they realize that the way they've been living their life is unacceptable from a moral, religious standpoint. They realize that they have not been a good Muslim and they want to change that. Now we see that you actually can still manage to turn things around. Someone you can't get back the lost time. You can't get back the lost opportunities for good deeds. You can wipe out the bad deeds, though, through repentance. So first off, there's that. And second off, because Allah ultimately forgives everything, you can basically get a blank slate. Right? A convert literally gets a blank slate. You could be 70 years old and have lived a horrible life, and you convert to Islam, and if you do it sincerely, and you practice the faith afterwards, it's like you had a completely blank slate, like you were just born. So that kind of midlife crisis is actually very different from a secular midlife crisis.
So there's a couple of things, just because this is always sort of a sticking point. One, what it means to convert, in light of the idea that you get a blank slate. It has to mean something like the entirety of the way in which you perceive the world, your entire metaphysical concept of the world, and who you are and what you are, all the rest of that, it has to change. So in effect, you actually become a completely different person. And you can't just sort of, it's not about, this is a problem that a lot of people sort of seem to imagine it this way. You said some words and now it's all fine. And it's like, no, I'm sorry, Islam isn't pitching a Harry Potter version of the universe, right? It's not a magical spell, it's a complete transformation of self. And what would be required as part of that, right, would involve not just going like, whoops, I screwed up, but for everything that you screwed up, you need to not just desire to fix, you need to actually make the fullest extent of effort to fix. So if I robbed you and then I had a conversion moment, I can't go like, well, I've been forgiven. Like, no, you've still been robbed. I still owe you money, right? I owe you reparations in some sense for the evil that I did, right? It's the same as sort of learning about what's acceptable and unacceptable. And like, once you've learned it, given the fact that you've acted before that, you go like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and at the very least you go like, I'm so sorry. But the attempt to fix things means that you are not sort of forgiven in the worldly sense. If you had committed murder and then you turned it around, you would still have to go back and stand for the trial. And in fact, you wouldn't be allowed to wait for the authorities to maybe find out that you did it and then hunt you down. You'd actually have to go turn yourself in and fully confess as to what happened. Because what you did is still a crime. You still have to provide restitution to the injured party one way or the other. And if you don't do that here, then eschatologically, you have to do it over there. Right? People that you've harmed, you have injured their right. Part of the Day of Judgment explanation is that the rights of anybody who have been wronged have to be set right. Well, it's sort of coming out of your account, so to speak. Now, the idea with conversion is that sort of God covers most of your account, right? The other person isn't wronged in any way, but you're not really responsible for paying the debts, so long as you had worked to actually repay those debts while alive, right? So I think that's important, because quite often there's this idea, I mean, I've heard people say things like, well, when like I'm gonna do whatever I feel like doing now, and then when it's, for example, time to get married, I'm going to become Muslim and get all that wiped out. And it's like, no, as soon as you're sort of trying to game the system no longer allows you in, right? Because the whole premise is that this rests on an all-knowing God, and therefore you can't game the system. You're doing it wrong. The same thing with insincere conversions and all the rest of that. You can't game the system, and that's part of the point of the eschatological pitch, that judgment is always based on complete truth, both of your actions and your intentions and your thoughts, and so all of that's worked in, and so you can't dodge the punishment when it comes to judgment. In that sense, the same way that you can dodge punishment in this world by being charismatic enough, lying well enough, so on and so forth.
hiring a good enough lawyer.
Yes.
Yes.
If the glove does not fit, that is not going to fly.
Team of really good lawyers.
Like that's not going to fly on the Day of Judgment. Is sort of the idea that's being presented.
And the idea here is, in order to have perfect judgment, and by extension perfect justice, the one giving that justice, Allah, must be all-knowing. It becomes a requirement.
Yes. Anytime you can hide things from a judge, anytime the judge is not in possession of absolute truth, that judge can make a mistake. And if a judge can make a mistake, that means that the unjust can walk and the just can be punished. And the whole point of the Day of Judgment sort of idea there is that such a thing cannot happen. Now, oddly enough, all the traditional religions are going to have that. Even things like Taoism and Hinduism, right? Where you don't have, granted in Hinduism it's a little bit harder to see, but their concept of God is more of a force than an entity per se. Originally, by the way, just so we're clear, go pick up like the original text and read those. That you'll find the same thing in Taoism, right? Where the Tao is the universal force that sort of manages everything without any emotion, right? If you screw up, the Tao doesn't get mad at you and therefore crushes you into nothing. If you screw up, it's the equivalent of like walking off a building and gravity taking over. Gravity isn't mad at you, right? But there are consequences for your behavior, and the only part that matters there is truth. The same way that you can't trick gravity, you can't trick the Tao. And so every religion seems to have this particular idea built in. You cannot cheat the final judgment.
Great. Let's move on. We actually covered the next sentence in some of the things we talked about earlier, since the conclusion, that if you treat that sentence as a conclusion of the previous one,
yes,
it follows pretty clearly.
Yes.
That sentence would be, this would happen since no matter what man achieves in this world, there is always the certitude that these achievements will ultimately flounder and disappear. So, let's move on to the next idea. The greatest material achievements, not only of the individual, but also of whole civilizations, can in fact do wither away. Again, we've covered that in the process of discussing these other things here.
Yes.
It is only the eschatological realities which bring into focus the permanent, abiding, and eternal consequences of human actions, precisely because human beings are beings created for immortality and the eternal world. Let's take a look at that last idea there. Human beings are beings created for immortality and the eternal world. Let's break that down. What is he trying to say here?
So I think you can read this at least two ways. One is the religious sense of, from the Islamic perspective, the whole purpose of creating human beings is what happens to them post-judgment. Like the pre-judgment part is just sort of in order to facilitate judgment, and then where you end up, that is what you're actually made for. The other way of thinking of this, and I don't think that this is going to be too far off point, sort of knowing Sayyid Hussein Nasr's ideas, what it means to be a human being is to experience this detachment from the physical, right? It's let's call it an indication of the fact that a human being is more than their body. And in our everyday experience, and again, you'll find this literally as far back as you go in human history, right? We have indications of this way pre-written records. So the idea is something like, what I am is definitely includes my body, but it's not limited to it. So for example, I dropped a metal grinder on my hand a couple of years ago, and it went through the glove, and it went through a part of my knuckle here, and it opened up a gash about 2 inches long, all the way down to the tendon. And when you make a cut that big, the skin just sort of sloughs off the side. It looks terrifying. But the thing is, like, I could look into that hole, and as I moved my finger back and forth, I saw the tendon underneath actually slide over the joint. The me that was there didn't feel cut. My body was cut. My body was damaged. My concept of who I am wasn't. Right? So myself wasn't damaged, even though the vessel was. Now, to a lesser extent, you can think of this yourself. When you cut your hair, you're technically cutting off a part of yourself. But is there less of you because of a haircut? If you gain weight, are you more yourself? And so we had this weird detachment from the material us, and then definitely from the material everything else in the world. And so every civilization that we know of came up exactly with this idea that there are two parts of you. There's the material part of you, and when you die, that's a part that dies off. And then there's the immaterial part of you, which just sort of goes on, right? And that means that you are, in a very particular sense, permanent. What a human being is, according to every civilization prior to roughly late Enlightenment, has been an ensouled entity in a material body. And that ensouled entity, because it's not destroyed in any meaningful way, is an eternal one that sort of goes on forever. And in order to account for what that means, you have to have some sort of an eschatological understanding of, well, what happens after you die? Because the part of you that dies is only the material one, and then what about the rest of you? What about the part that you actually think of yourself as being?
Sounds great. In the process of having this conversation, I was reminded of how, again, there are numerous places in the Quran where Allah mentions the Day of Judgment, resurrection, all these things, and also reminding human beings of death, that we will die. The Prophet ﷺ in numerous hadith also advised people to remember death, to think about death more often. And so if you are ever wondering why that is, hopefully the things we've covered in this conversation will help with that. I'm sure we didn't hit on every single reason why it's important to remember and to think about your death, but hopefully we covered a lot of them here, right? The idea that, you know, it's not really the end of things, but aside from a few key things, a few things like charity, or perhaps righteous children, it's the end of the book, right? Your book is shut at that point, aside from a few things. And you have no guarantee, and you're not really entitled to any particular length of life. So you don't get to complain to Allah if you die at the age of 30 that, well, if you'd only given me more time, I'd have been good, right? You don't get to choose when you can start being Muslim for real. And
I mean,
if someone thinks
you do
about
get
it,
to choose.
right?
It's just that you ought to choose as soon as you're an adult.
Right.
Start moving in that direction.
What I mean is, you don't get to choose it in the sense that you can be guaranteed that it will actually happen at that time.
Yes.
Because you cannot guarantee that you will still be alive at that time.
I've heard people go like, well, you know, when I get older, then, you know, I go to Hajj and then I become Muslim, like, for real, and then I start praying.
Right. Who's to say you're going to make it to 50 or 60 to even get to go to Hajj? If you've got the money and you can afford to do it when you're young, you should do it when you get the chance.
Yeah, in fact, it's
this
considered
year,
a problem if you
almost
don't.
no one got to go, right? Imagine that you had been planning specifically to go this year. I don't know, let's say for the last 15 or 20 years, you've been saying, well, I'll go next year, and they said, all right, 2020, that's the year. I'm going to go to Hajj. And then 2020 happened. And if you're listening to this, you know what I mean, that 2020 happened. You know, 10 or 20 years from now, or even farther, we will probably still be talking about this year. I really hope so. Because if we're not, it means the years afterwards were even worse. They were so bad we actually forgot about how bad 2020 was.
No, you know what? I gotta be honest. It's not that bad. It's mostly. It's not even uncomfortable. Now, granted, right? I'm speaking as somebody whose job hasn't been compromised, whose ability to live hasn't been compromised. It's mostly been, I think, for the majority of people, it's mostly just been frustrating. Right? I've been like the very fact that we have conversations about like whether or not masks ought to be mandated or not. I think tells you everything you need to know. I happen to have grown up in a war zone. There was no question about whether or not getting the hell out of the way of a sniper was a thing that you ought to do, right? Because snipers, right? So when you hit the point where everybody agrees, I think that's when you're in actual trouble. So long as you're still at a place where people can disagree and argue about what measures should be taken, you're still alright. Granted, it is a serious departure from the way that we're used to living life, but perhaps it's actually worth noting that the sort of stress that we're under is still less than what a lot of people around the world go through in an average year. And here we are freaking out and worried about everything and so on and so forth. So, which isn't to say that you shouldn't worry, that you shouldn't be involved, that you shouldn't try to fix things as best you can, and so on and so forth. But it is to sort of put things into perspective a little bit, right?
Sure. Yeah, the idea you're talking about is related to something called relative deprivation. So on the one hand, you have absolute deprivation, such as abject poverty. Relative deprivation, though, is your neighbor has a bigger car than you, and all of a sudden you feel bad, even though when you bought that car, you loved it. It was the best car you'd had in your life. There's a really fascinating experiment that was done with this, with maybe chimpanzees. It was a kind of monkey. What they did was they trained them to perform a task. And in exchange for performing this task, they got a little wedge of cucumber. Now, chimpanzees like cucumber, right? It's it's watery, it's kind of tasty, right? It's good, right? We like cucumbers. So the chimps were perfectly happy to perform this task and get their cucumber as a reward. And then they started rewarding some of the chimps with grapes instead. Now, a cucumber is nice, but it's still a vegetable. A grape is a fruit, and it's sweet, and they especially love grapes. So, like, they showed this on video as well. Chimp 1 performs the task, he grabs a rock and gives it to the researcher. Researcher gives him a cucumber piece. Chimp 2 goes, grabs a rock, gives it to the researcher, gives him a grape. Now, Chimp 1 sees this. He sees that Chimp 2 got a grape instead. Chimp 2 quite gladly eats the grape. Well, Chimp 1 sees this and says, so that means that I get grapes now? He goes, he runs, grabs another one, and brings it back really fast to give it to them so that he can get his grape too. And they gave him a cucumber.
How'd that play out?
The equivalent of a temper tantrum. He threw it down and started jumping up and down angrily. Then ran, grabbed another rock, and tried once again, was given a cucumber again, and lost his mind. Meanwhile, Chimp 2 just casually goes, gets another rock, gives it to the researchers, gets another grape. Chimp 1 sees this and goes ballistic.
Oh, man.
It perfectly encapsulates the idea of relative deprivation, because when they're both getting the cucumber, they're both perfectly happy. Now, Chimp 1, if he only thought in terms of like raw units of pleasure, right? The basic idea of Jeremy Bentham, right? That we can actually, count out units of pleasure and pain. If the chimp only thought in those terms, then it should make a difference. He performed the task, he got the reward. If he was satisfied with the reward the first time, he should still be satisfied with it the second time, the third time, the 1,000,000th time. But there must be in there some sense of fairness, right? The reason why relative deprivation is something that human beings pay attention to, and I suppose by extension chimpanzees, and I believe you can find it with many other species too, the reason why it even exists is because of a certain innate sense of fairness. And if that is violated, then it doesn't matter anymore that the cucumber is something you'd like, because it's not fair that he got to get a grape and I only got a cucumber.
It's a great story. I'm thinking maybe in terms of metaphysics, because again, right, that's a philosopher part of me thinking. If you understand how the world works, right, you make your assumptions, you have your theory developed, you know what it is that you're supposed to do so that the world will behave in the way that you want it to behave. So long as it behaves that way, it's fine, right? And then you notice that when other people do the same thing that you do, the world behaves differently. And the problem there is that you can't work out immediately what's going on. Besides the fact that rather obviously your understanding of the world is now somehow wrong. Right? So how is it that, when that monkey hands over a rock, and so, I mean, if he was performing a different task, perhaps this wouldn't be an issue. But if he does the same thing I do, how is it that he gets a grape and I only get a cucumber? And why am I unable to why can't I get the world to behave the way I want it to behave? And this, by the way, is something that you have to sort of teach your toddlers. And if you don't, you end up with a sort of kid that has a very hard time being socialized because he's constantly having temper tantrums. If you, as a parent, respond to your child having a temper tantrum, like, first off, what is a temper tantrum? It is what happens when the object of your desire is not reachable by you in a way that you predict things ought to behave, right? So you think you understand the world, you try to act it out, it's not working, and what you're going to attempt to do is you're going to try to find a path, you're going to try to invent a new behavior that's going to get you the thing that you want. And so you throw a tantrum. That is the most obvious thing for you for some reason that you can do. Now, if your parent responds and they give you the thing you want, congratulations, you've just taught them how to interact with the world. Now, if you ignore them, kids are pretty sharp, and they go like, okay, well, this isn't working. And so they'll try, option B, option C, option D, until they find something that works. And the thing that you sort of reward, not to get behavioralist about it, that essentially tells you how to interact with the world so that you get what you want. Now, as an adult, if the world suddenly stops doing what you want it to do, that's when we start having psychological breakdowns. Right? PTSD is what happens when the world does a really hard U-turn on you. Right? You behaved in a certain way, there are certain expectations, and you get the exact opposite. And not like a little bit, you got to get whacked with it really, really hard. And suddenly you're no longer able to make any sense of the world. The thing that ought to have worked not only didn't work, it produced a complete counterindication, and you no longer know how to be. Right? You don't know what to do in the world so that the world doesn't attempt to murder you. Now, I use murder here because if you sort of rewind back a few thousand years, nature is an extremely deadly place. You make a mistake, it tends to kill you or maim you. So if you're in a forest and you hear a sound behind you and you go like, that sounds like a bunny, and then it turns out that it's a bear, right? Like, you get to make that mistake once, generally speaking. But your understanding of the world was so bad that you went from harmless to death that quick. So when your understanding of the world shifts that quickly, you end up just sort of lost, looking for meaning, looking for a way to interpret the world so that you know how to behave, so that it will give you the things that you want and you won't get the things that you don't want. So, yeah, monkeys, humans, the psychology seems the same, which I think is kind of sad for us, really.
Alright, how about we call it here?
Yeah, I think that's
We covered everything
that's a
in
pretty
this section.
solid part. All right. Thank you for listening. If you got questions or comments, feel free to email us or leave a comment in the comments below, and we'll see you for Chapter 3.